Sirens wailed, cutting through the freezing November air, as flashing red and blue lights illuminated the pristine exterior of a dark Mercedes. Inside sat a man 2 weeks away from a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land. By dawn, the metal biting into his wrists would shatter a barrier-breaking career. This isn't just a story about a badge and a gavel. It is a chilling autopsy of political sabotage, engineered so perfectly it destroyed a man's legacy before he even took the oath. Rain slicked the asphalt of Connecticut Avenue, reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights like spilled gold. It was 1:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. Inside the soundproof cabin of his Mercedes S-Class, Judge Calvin Reynolds rubbed his temples, listening to the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. At 54, Calvin was at the absolute pinnacle of the American legal profession. A federal appellate judge with a mind like a steel trap, he had just endured a grueling 14-hour murder board session with White House counsel. In exactly 13 days, he was scheduled to sit before the Senate Judiciary Committee to confirm his nomination to the United States Supreme Court. He was exhausted. His silk tie hung loose around his neck, and his briefcase stuffed with thousands of pages of constitutional precedents sat heavy on the passenger seat. Calvin had spent his entire life playing by the rules, meticulously crafting a reputation of unshakable composure and unimpeachable integrity. He was a black man who had navigated the treacherous old money waters of the Ivy League and the federal judiciary with a quiet, lethal brilliance. He flipped on his turn signal to merge onto a quiet, tree-lined street in Chevy Chase, Maryland. He was 3 miles from home, 3 miles from his wife Diane and a glass of scotch. Then the darkness in his rearview mirror exploded into a blinding strobe of red and blue. Calvin's pulse ticked up a notch, a primal reaction ingrained in him despite his robes and his titles. He checked his speedometer. 32 in a 35 zone. Both hands instantly went to the steering wheel, gripping it at the 10 and 2 position. He pulled over smoothly, killed the engine, and rolled down the window, letting the freezing, damp air rush into the heated cabin. A spotlight hit his side mirror, blinding him. He heard the heavy, purposeful crunch of boots on wet gravel. "Evening, officer." Calvin said, his voice a calm, practiced baritone. He did not move his hands from the wheel. The officer stepped into the periphery of the window. His name tag read Mitchell. Officer Brendan Mitchell was young, thick-necked, and chewing gum with an aggressive, rhythmic intensity. His hand rested casually on the butt of his service weapon. License registration and proof of insurance. "Now," Mitchell barked, leaning in. The smell of wet wool and cheap coffee wafted into the car. "They are in my glove compartment, Officer Mitchell. I am going to reach across slowly to retrieve them," Calvin stated, telegraphing his movements exactly as he had taught his own son to do years ago. "I didn't ask for a speech. Just get the papers," Mitchell snapped, shining his heavy tactical flashlight directly into Calvin's eyes. Calvin blinked through the glare, his jaw tightening slightly. "There's no need for that. I am complying." He reached over, popped the glove box, and handed his documents out the window. Mitchell snatched them. He didn't even look at the name on the license. Instead, he stepped back, keying his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, I got a male suspect, matching the description of the armed robbery out of Bethesda. Dark sedan. Requesting backup." Calvin's blood ran cold. "Officer, there must be some mistake. I am a federal judge returning from the White House. This is my vehicle. Step out of the car." Mitchell ordered, his voice suddenly dropping an octave, losing its casual aggression and taking on a cold, mechanical authority. "Excuse me," Calvin asked, genuine shock piercing his practiced stoicism. "For a traffic stop, I said, step out of the vehicle now." Mitchell roared, drawing his weapon and aiming it directly at Calvin's chest. The sheer absurdity of the moment collided with the terrifying reality of the barrel pointed at him. Calvin slowly opened the door, his hands raised in the air. The freezing rain soaked his dress shirt instantly as he stepped onto the asphalt. "Turn around! Face the car! Hands behind your back!" Mitchell commanded. "Officer Mitchell, you are making a profound error," Calvin said, keeping his voice steady, refusing to let the panic show. "If you run my plates—" Mitchell lunged forward, grabbing Calvin's right arm and wrenching it behind his back with enough force to tear the rotator cuff. Calvin gasped in pain, his chest slammed against the wet roof of the Mercedes. The cold, unyielding steel of handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting into the skin. "Stop resisting," Mitchell yelled loudly, though Calvin hadn't moved a muscle. "I am not resisting." Calvin gritted out through the pain in his shoulder. 2 more squad cars screeched to a halt behind the Mercedes. 4 officers piled out hands on their holsters. Mitchell shoved Calvin backward, forcing him to his knees on the wet, abrasive road. The freezing puddle soaked through his tailored suit pants. Neighbors' porch lights flicked on. Silhouettes appeared in windows. Calvin knelt there in the rain, the icy water seeping into his bones, his wrists bound like a common criminal. He looked up at Mitchell, who was standing over him. For a split second, the streetlights caught Mitchell's eyes. There was no fear in the cop's face. There was no adrenaline, no confusion. There was only a cold, quiet satisfaction. At that exact moment across the street, a dark SUV sat idling. A faint red light from a high-definition telephoto lens blinked in the darkness. The trap had been sprung perfectly. By 6 a.m. the next morning, Calvin Reynolds was no longer just a brilliant jurist. He was the main character of the American internet. He had been released from the precinct at 3:30 a.m. after a frantic, apologetic phone call from a police captain, Edward Lawson, who blamed a catastrophic dispatch glitch and a rookie's overzealousness. Calvin had gone home in silence, stripped off his ruined suit and sat in his study, staring at the wall until dawn. Then his phone rang. It was Amanda Croft, his chief of staff. Her voice was trembling. "Calvin, turn on the news. Channel 4. Now." Calvin grabbed the remote and flicked on the screen. His stomach plummeted into an abyss. It wasn't a blurry cell phone video. It was the police dash cam footage, and it had been heavily maliciously edited. The clip skipped the initial polite exchange entirely. It started exactly at the moment Calvin opened his car door. But the audio had been altered. Instead of Mitchell's unprovoked escalation, the tape played a chaotic, muffled audio track where Calvin sounded agitated, demanding, "Do you know who I am? I don't have to listen to you." Then the video cut to Calvin being slammed against the car with Mitchell yelling, "Stop resisting! Stop reaching for your waist!" The screen flashed to the anchors. Breaking news this morning. Supreme Court nominee Judge Calvin Reynolds was detained overnight following a combative altercation with police. Sources within the department claim Reynolds became belligerent and physically resistant during a routine stop. They doctored the audio. Calvin whispered the remote, slipping from his hand. "Amanda, I never said those words. He never told me I was reaching for my waist." "I know, Calvin. I know," Amanda said, typing furiously on her end of the line. "But it doesn't matter what you said. It's on the Daily Patriot blog, it's all over social media, and the major networks just picked it up. We have a 5-alarm fire. By 9 a.m., the White House had gone completely silent. The president's press secretary cancelled the morning briefing. The political ecosystem smelled blood in the water. In a high-rise office on K Street, Simon West, Calvin's seasoned PR director, paced furiously in front of a whiteboard. "FOIA requests for body cams take weeks, sometimes months in this county." Simon barked at his junior staff. This tape was uploaded to a dark money political blog 4 hours after the arrest. 4 hours this was handed to them. Someone engineered this. Can we prove it? Amanda asked, leaning over the conference table, her eyes bloodshot. Not before the narrative sets like concrete, Simon replied grimly. Look at the trending topics. They aren't talking about his jurisprudence. They're calling him Angry Judge Reynolds. They're using every dog whistle in the playbook. At 11 a.m., the true architect of the disaster stepped in front of the microphones. Senator Richard Albright, the formidable silver-haired chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, called an impromptu press conference on the steps of the Capitol. Albright had spent the last month desperately looking for a way to sink Reynolds' nomination without appearing blatantly partisan. Reynolds was too clean, too respected. Until now, the footage we all woke up to this morning is deeply disturbing, Albright intoned, looking somberly into the cameras. The Supreme Court requires a temperament of absolute restraint, respect for the rule of law, and respect for our brave men and women in uniform. What I saw on that tape was a man who believes he is above the law. A man who became aggressive with police officers, a reporter shouted from the press gaggle. Senator Albright Judge Reynolds' team claims the video is doctored, and he was entirely cooperative. Will you wait for the full investigation? Albright smiled, a thin, predatory smile. The camera doesn't lie, Jim. And frankly, the Senate Judiciary Committee cannot in good conscience proceed with a standard hearing while the nominee is under criminal investigation for resisting arrest. Criminal investigation, the reporter yelled back. He was released without charges. As of an hour ago, Albright said smoothly, the police union has filed a formal grievance, and the local prosecutor has announced an inquiry into whether Judge Reynolds assaulted Officer Mitchell during the scuffle. Therefore, I am moving the committee hearings up. We will not be discussing constitutional law on Monday. We will be holding a special session on the character and fitness of Judge Calvin Reynolds. He will testify under oath about his behavior on that asphalt. Back in his study, Calvin watched Albright's press conference with a chilling realization. This was never about a traffic stop. Amanda, Calvin said softly into the speakerphone. I'm here, Calvin. Pull everything you can on Officer Brendan Mitchell. Calvin ordered, the judicial calm returning to his voice, replacing the shock with an icy, analytical focus. Look at his financials. Look at his phone records. Look at his commanding officers. A beat cop doesn't have the connections to leak a doctored dash cam to a national political blog in 4 hours. Somebody paid him. Somebody told him exactly which car to pull over. We have 5 days until the hearing, Calvin. Albright is going to turn it into a circus. Let him, Calvin said, staring at the frozen frame of Albright's smiling face on the television. If they want a trial, I'll give them one. The Dirksen Senate office building was a zoo. Camera flashes fired like strobe lights as Calvin Reynolds, flanked by Amanda Croft and Simon West, walked down the marble corridor toward room 226. Protesters from both sides lined the halls, their screams echoing off the high ceilings. Calvin wore a charcoal suit, his posture impeccably straight, betraying none of the deep bruising that still painted his right shoulder from the handcuffs. Inside the hearing room, the air was suffocatingly tense. The mahogany dais curved around the front of the room like a Roman amphitheater, with Senator Richard Albright sitting at the dead center, looking down from his elevated perch. The committee will come to order, Albright announced, banging his gavel. The heavy thud silenced the room. Calvin took his seat at the solitary witness table in the center of the floor. He adjusted the microphone. Judge Reynolds. Albright began clasping his hands together. He skipped the pleasantries. He skipped the reading of Calvin's resume. This committee is tasked with determining if a nominee possesses the judicial temperament required for the highest court in the land. Last Tuesday, the American people witnessed what happens when you are stripped of your robes and placed in a stressful situation. You became hostile. You fought with law enforcement. You demanded special treatment. Senator Jessor. Calvin said, leaning into the microphone, his voice cutting through the room with absolute authority. With respect, the premise of your question is based on a fabricated video. I was courteous. I was compliant. I was assaulted. Assaulted. Albright feigned shock, leaning back in his leather chair. Judge Reynolds, we have the police report right here. Officer Mitchell reported that you aggressively reached into your vehicle, ignoring direct commands, forcing him to draw his weapon for his own safety. Officer Mitchell lied, Calvin stated flatly. A murmur rippled through the gallery. That is a severe accusation to hurl at a decorated officer. Albright warned, his eyes narrowing. Especially since we have new testimony. Albright gestured to his aide, who handed out thick manila folders to the other senators on the committee. We have just received a sworn affidavit from another officer on the scene. Albright said, his voice dripping with theatrical gravity. Officer Gary Miller, who arrived as backup. Officer Miller swears under oath that he heard you threaten to end Officer Mitchell's career. Furthermore, we pulled a sealed complaint from your time as an assistant district attorney 22 years ago. A complaint detailing a combative and aggressive verbal altercation with a courthouse security guard. It paints a pattern, Judge Reynolds. A pattern of a man who cannot control his temper when challenged. Amanda Croft, sitting behind Calvin, felt the blood drain from her face. The college complaint was a complete nothing burger, a 20-year-old misunderstanding about a lost ID badge. But in this room, Albright was weaponizing it flawlessly to fit the angry black man narrative. It was textbook character assassination. You are constructing a fiction senator, Calvin said, keeping his breathing steady, though his hands gripped the edges of the table tightly. Have you subpoenaed the raw, unedited audio files from the police cruisers? We don't need to, Albright countered smoothly. The precinct's tech division reported a fatal corruption in the raw hard drives from that night. A tragic technical failure. The only surviving footage is what the public has already seen. Calvin stared at Albright. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. The evidence had been wiped. Senator. Calvin said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register that made the room lean in. You are a former prosecutor. You know that hard drives do not spontaneously corrupt selectively. You know that a beat cop does not have the clearance to scrub a precinct server. You are presiding over a cover-up. Watch your tone, Judge, Albright snapped, banging the gavel again. You are not in your courtroom. You are in mine. And what a hollow courtroom it is, Calvin replied, staring directly into Albright's eyes. Suddenly, Amanda's phone buzzed violently in her lap. She glanced down. It was an encrypted message from a private investigator Simon West had hired 3 days ago. Amanda read the message, her eyes widening. She quickly scribbled on a yellow legal pad and slid it onto the table directly in front of Calvin. Calvin glanced down. The note read, Brendan Mitchell's sister works for a PAC. The PAC is funded by Vanguard Horizon. Vanguard Horizon's chairman is Albright's brother-in-law. $250,000 deposited into an offshore account for Mitchell yesterday. Calvin's eyes flicked back up to Albright. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. This wasn't just a dirty cop. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee had orchestrated an armed assault on a federal judge to protect his political majority. Senator Albright. Calvin said, the air in the room suddenly growing razor-sharp. Since we are discussing patterns of behavior and the sudden miraculous appearance of affidavits, Calvin picked up the yellow legal pad. Let's discuss a political action committee called Vanguard Horizon. Albright's smug expression froze. The color instantly vanished from the senator's face. The pen in his hand slipped clattering loudly against the wooden dais. Calvin leaned forward, the microphone picking up the sharp intake of his breath. Let's discuss the $250,000 wired to an offshore account controlled by Officer Brendan Mitchell just 24 hours ago. Shall we? The hearing room descended into absolute deafening silence. The guillotine had been dropped, but the crowd suddenly realized the wrong neck might be on the block. The silence in room 226 lasted for exactly 3 seconds before the entire chamber detonated. Camera shutters fired in a blinding continuous strobe. Reporters shouted over one another, abandoning all decorum, their voices echoing off the marble walls in a chaotic crescendo. In the center of the storm, Judge Calvin Reynolds remained perfectly still. His eyes locked on Senator Richard Albright. Albright's face had drained to a sickly, ashen gray, but the survival instincts of a 30-year Washington veteran kicked in violently. He grabbed his wooden gavel and slammed it down with enough force to crack the sound block. Out of order! Albright roared, his voice cracking through the PA system. This committee will come to order immediately. Judge Reynolds, you are peddling baseless, slanderous conspiracy theories to distract from your own criminal behavior. Subpoena the wire transfers. Senator Fuss. Calvin fired back his voice, cutting through the din like a serrated blade. If it is a conspiracy theory, prove me wrong under oath. Bring Officer Mitchell into this room. Let's ask him how a municipal patrolman affords a $250,000 offshore trust. This hearing is in recess, Albright shouted, slamming the gavel a final time. Sergeant-at-Arms, clear this room. Clear the gallery. Within minutes, the footage of the confrontation was playing on a continuous loop across every major global news network. The narrative had fractured. Half the country still saw Calvin as the angry judge, but a massive, incredibly loud contingent was now looking directly at Senator Albright. Back in the secure war room of Calvin's K Street Legal Defense Headquarters, the atmosphere was suffocating with adrenaline and stale coffee. Simon West Calvin's PR director was pacing frantically, clutching a tablet. We kicked the hornet's nest, Simon said, breathless. CNN is running the Vanguard Horizon connection. Fox is calling you a desperate man slinging mud. Albright's office just released a statement claiming his brother-in-law has zero operational oversight of that PAC and threatening a defamation lawsuit. Amanda Croft walked into the room, followed by a man who looked distinctly out of place among the tailored Washington elites. He wore a faded leather jacket and had the exhausted, cynical eyes of a man who spent his life digging through other people's garbage. His name was Victor Shaw, the private investigator who had texted Amanda the bombshell during the hearing. Shaw dropped a thick, disorganized manila folder onto the mahogany conference table. Albright is lying, and he knows it, Shaw said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He opened the folder, spreading out bank statements with redacted routing numbers. Vanguard Horizon is a dark money slush fund. 3 days ago, they paid a security consulting fee to a shell company in Delaware. That shell company transferred the exact same amount, $250,000, to a Cayman account registered to a Brenda Mitchell. That's Officer Mitchell's sister. Calvin leaned over the table, studying the digits. Can we authenticate these documents for a federal court? We need to bypass the Senate and go straight to the Department of Justice. Shaw shook his head slowly. That's the problem, Judge. I acquired these extra-legally. A friend at a clearinghouse owed me a favor. If you hand these to the DOJ, they'll ask for the warrant that produced them. Since there isn't one, the evidence is inadmissible. Worse, the Attorney General is a political ally of Albright's. He'll bury it and they'll arrest me for cyber trespassing. Calvin exhaled, rubbing his temples. He was a creature of the law. He had spent his life upholding the rules of evidence, and now those exact rules were providing an impenetrable shield for the men trying to destroy him. By 8 p.m. that evening, the counterattack began. Calvin returned to his home in Chevy Chase to find his wife Diane standing in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. Diane was a formidable force in her own right, a senior partner at a massive corporate law firm. She ended the call and turned to Calvin, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and fear. "That was my managing partner," Diane said, her voice trembling slightly. "The IRS just notified the firm that they are opening a full-spectrum multi-year audit into my specific client accounts. Furthermore, the federal grant money for the inner-city literacy charity I chair, it was frozen an hour ago by the Senate Appropriations Committee, pending a routine review." Calvin felt the air leave his lungs. They weren't just coming for his career anymore. Albright was utilizing the full, terrifying weight of the federal government to burn Calvin's entire life to the ground. "They are trying to starve us out," Calvin whispered, pulling Diane into an embrace. "Albright is sending a message. If I don't withdraw my nomination, he will destroy your firm and your charity." He pulled back, looking into his wife's eyes. "Diane, I can't let them ruin you. I should step down. I can hold a press conference tomorrow, withdraw my name, and this all stops." Diane's expression hardened. The fear evaporated, replaced by cold, absolute resolve. She gripped Calvin's forearms tightly. "Listen to me," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "We do not back down to thugs wearing expensive suits. You have worked your entire life for this seat. If you step down, they win. They prove that a black man can be publicly lynched by a dirty cop and a corrupt politician, and no one will do a damn thing about it. You fight them, Calvin. You burn them to the ground." Calvin stared at her, the exhaustion in his bones instantly replaced by a renewed, lethal clarity. "Okay," Calvin said quietly. "Then we don't play defense anymore." His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Amanda. "Calvin," Amanda said, her voice tight with anxiety. "You need to get to a secure line. Now." "What is it?" "It's Officer Gary Shepard," Amanda replied, referring to the backup cop who had signed the fake affidavit, claiming Calvin was aggressive. "He just called my burner. He's terrified. He says Albright is tying up loose ends, and he thinks he's next. He wants to meet." The rain had returned, a freezing, miserable drizzle that slicked the pavement of an abandoned strip mall parking lot in Alexandria, Virginia. It was 2 a.m. Calvin sat in the passenger seat of Victor Shaw's unmarked, rusted Ford Explorer. Amanda was in the back. They waited in total silence, the engine off the windows, fogging up from their breath. A pair of headlights swept across the cracked asphalt. A beaten-up Honda Civic pulled into the lot, parking 3 spaces away. The headlights cut out. A man stepped out into the rain wearing a dark hoodie, pulled low over his face. He looked around frantically before rushing to the back door of the Explorer and sliding inside. Officer Gary Shepard was shaking uncontrollably. He was 30 years old, pale, and reeked of stale cigarettes and raw panic. "Turn your phones off," Shepard demanded, immediately his eyes darting to the windows. "Take the batteries out if you can. Mitchell has a Stingray device. He can spoof cell towers and track locations. That's how they found you on Connecticut Avenue, Judge. They tracked your car from the White House." Calvin powered down his phone. "Take a breath, Officer Shepard. You are safe here." "I'm not safe anywhere," Shepard hissed, his voice cracking. "You don't understand the people you're messing with. It's not just Albright. It's Captain Lawson. It's the union reps. They're all getting a piece of the Vanguard money." "Tell us exactly what happened that night," Amanda said softly, pulling out a small analog tape recorder and clicking it on. Shepard stared at the recorder for a second, swallowing hard before the dam broke. "Mitchell got the call on his personal burner phone." Shepard began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "We were told a high-value target needed to be humbled on camera. They gave Mitchell your plates. When you pulled over, the arrest was pure theatre. The dash cam was real, but the audio was completely wiped and redubbed by a private tech contractor Vanguard hired. They erased the original files from the precinct server the next morning. And the affidavit you signed. Calvin asked, his voice steady, though a deep, simmering rage burned in his chest. The one claiming I threatened Mitchell. Captain Lawson handed it to me. Shepard admitted, looking down at his trembling hands. He said if I signed it, I'd get my detective shield in 6 months. If I didn't, he'd make sure I was assigned to the narcotics task force without backup, and maybe I wouldn't come home to my kids. Then a guy in a tailored suit showed up at my house and left a duffel bag with $50,000 in cash on my kitchen table. "Can you identify the man in the suit?" Shaw asked from the driver's seat. "I didn't get his name," Shepard said. "But he had a Vanguard Horizon pin on his lapel. They wanted me to know who was paying. Gary, we need you to testify," Calvin said, leaning back to look the officer in the eye. "We can take you to the FBI in the morning. We can secure federal protection for your family. But we need you to say this under oath." Shepard shook his head violently. "The FBI? Are you crazy? The DOJ is in Albright's pocket. The moment I walk into a federal building, Lawson will know. I'll be dead before I reach a grand jury." "We can go to the press," Amanda interjected. "We can do an exclusive hidden camera interview. Once the public hears your testimony, they can't touch you without proving their own guilt." "It's not enough," Shepard whispered, reaching into the front pocket of his hoodie. "It's just my word against a decorated officer and a precinct captain. But I have an insurance policy." He pulled out a small black USB drive and held it up in the dim light. "What is that?" Calvin asked. "Mitchell is arrogant," Shepard said, a bitter smile flashing across his face. "He thinks he's untouchable. 2 nights ago we were at a bar. He had a few too many and started bragging. He didn't know I was wearing a wire. He admitted to the whole thing, Judge. He admitted to the offshore account. He named Captain Lawson. He even bragged that a sitting U.S. senator personally guaranteed he'd never see a day in court." Amanda's eyes widened. This was the Holy Grail, an uncoerced confession from the primary assailant, tying the entire conspiracy together. Shepard handed the drive to Calvin. "Take it. But you don't release this until I have full written immunity from a federal judge outside of this circuit, and my family is on a plane to somewhere they can't be found." "You have my word," Calvin said, taking the drive. It felt heavy in his palm. "I'll contact a sympathetic judge in the Southern District of New York first thing in the morning." Calvin continued. "Lie low, Gary. Do not go into the precinct tomorrow." Shepard nodded, pulling his hood back up. He opened the door, stepping out into the freezing rain, and sprinted back to his Honda Civic. Calvin watched the taillights fade into the darkness. "Let's get this copied and encrypted immediately," he told Shaw. For the first time in a week, Calvin felt the tight grip of despair loosen. They had the weapon they needed, but Albright's machine was faster and far more ruthless than any of them anticipated. At 6:15 a.m. the next morning, Calvin was sitting in his study, reviewing the legal precedent for expedited witness protection, when the television in the corner flashed a breaking news alert. Calvin grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. A local news anchor stood in the rain in front of a mangled wreckage of steel. "Tragedy early this morning on Route 50, the anchor reported grimly. An off-duty police officer was killed in what authorities are describing as a horrific hit-and-run accident. Police have identified the victim as Officer Gary Shepard." The coffee cup slipped from Calvin's hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. According to preliminary reports, The anchor continued. Investigators found several empty liquor bottles in the vehicle, alongside a significant quantity of illegal narcotics. The department is launching an internal investigation into the disgraced officer, but they suspect he was driving under the influence when his vehicle struck a concrete embankment at high speed. Calvin stared at the screen, the blood roaring in his ears. They hadn't just killed him. They had planted drugs and alcohol in his car to completely discredit him posthumously. Even if Calvin released the audio tape, now Albright's spin machine would paint it as the desperate, deep-faked ravings of a corrupt, drug-addicted cop. The USB drive sat on Calvin's desk. It was no longer just evidence. It was the last will and testament of a murdered man. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Calvin picked it up, pressing it to his ear. He didn't say a word. It's a tragedy about Officer Shepard. Senator Albright's smooth, aristocratic voice purred through the speaker. A troubled young man. The stress of the badge can push people to dark, destructive places. Calvin's grip on the phone turned his knuckles white. Withdraw your nomination by noon. Judge Reynolds. Albright whispered all pretense of politeness, gone replaced by the chilling, absolute certainty of an apex predator. Or I promise you, the next tragic accident will hit much closer to home. The line went dead. Calvin slowly lowered the phone. The rules of the courtroom no longer applied. The Senate Judiciary Committee wasn't a hearing, it was an execution block. If Calvin was going to survive, he had to stop playing like a judge. He had to start playing like an executioner. By 8 a.m., the Reynolds residence was a fortress of silent, calculated activity. Calvin did not call the police. He did not call the Department of Justice. He knew that any move within the standard channels of law enforcement would be intercepted by Senator Richard Albright's sprawling network of influence. Instead, Calvin turned to his wife. Diane sat at the kitchen island, her laptop open, typing with the furious, precise speed of a senior partner at Kirkland & Ellis, one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms on the planet. They think I am just a federal judge, Calvin said, pacing the hardwood floor, his voice dangerously calm. They think my only weapon is a gavel. But Albright made a fatal error. He attacked your firm. He attacked the money. I just got off a secure line with the managing committee at Kirkland, Diane said, not looking up from her screen. We represent 3 of the largest institutional investors in Vanguard Horizon. When I told them that their political action committee is currently being investigated for utilizing $250,000 in investor capital to bribe a police officer and potentially fund the assassination of a whistleblower, the board went nuclear. Calvin stopped pacing. Can you freeze the PAC? Better. Diane smiled a sharp, terrifying expression. We are filing a massive civil RICO lawsuit in the Southern District of New York. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Because it's a civil filing initiated by defrauded private investors, it bypasses the Attorney General entirely. It immediately triggers an injunction. By noon, federal marshals, the ones who answer to the SD and Y, not Washington, will be kicking down the doors of Vanguard's K Street offices with discovery warrants. That cuts off Albright's wallet, Calvin said, his eyes narrowing. But it doesn't put him in handcuffs, and it doesn't protect us from whoever he sends next. Victor Shaw walked into the kitchen smelling of stale coffee and rain. He placed a burner phone on the marble counter. I found the bagman, Shaw rasped. The guy in the tailored suit who dropped the cash at Shepard's house. His name is Peter Langdon. He's a risk management consultant on retainer for Vanguard. I pulled his toll pass records. At 4:15 a.m. this morning, Langdon's Range Rover was clocked exactly 2 miles from the stretch of Route 50, where Officer Shepard was run off the road. "Langdon murdered him," Calvin said softly. "And he's sloppy," Shaw added. He didn't expect Shepard to die in a highly publicized crash. He expected him to disappear. "Langdon is currently hiding out in a private VIP suite at the Capitol Grill on Pennsylvania Avenue. He's day drinking, waiting for his charter flight to Geneva at 4 o'clock. Or, he's not going to Geneva," Calvin said, grabbing his wool overcoat. "He's going to sing." At 1:30 p.m., the lunch rush at the Capitol Grill was deafening. The restaurant smelled of dry-aged beef, expensive bourbon, and the invisible electric hum of Washington power brokering. Calvin walked past the mahogany host stand without stopping Victor Shaw, a massive, shadow-like presence trailing right behind him. They bypassed the main dining room and approached the private suites in the back. Shaw shoved the heavy oak door to the Roosevelt room open. Peter Langdon was sitting alone at a large, circular table, a half-empty bottle of Macallan 18 in front of him. He looked up, his face instantly draining of color as he recognized the federal judge whose life he had been paid to destroy. Langdon reached frantically for his breast pocket. Shaw moved with terrifying speed, crossing the room, grabbing Langdon by the lapels and slamming him brutally against the oak-paneled wall. A suppressed 9mm pistol clattered from Langdon's coat onto the carpet. "Sit down," Calvin commanded, pulling out a leather chair opposite Langdon. Shaw threw the trembling fixer into his seat, picking up the gun and sliding it into his own jacket. "You're trespassing," Langdon stammered, wiping a drop of spilled scotch from his chin. "I'll scream. I'll have you arrested." "Scream all you want, Peter," Calvin said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that echoed off the walls. "But before you do, I want you to look at my phone." Calvin slid his device across the table. On the screen was a live feed of the Kirkland and Ellis filing in New York. "As of 10 minutes ago, Vanguard Horizon's assets are frozen under a federal RICO statute," Calvin explained calmly. "Federal marshals are currently seizing their servers, which means they are seizing the offshore routing numbers, the ones tied to Officer Mitchell, and inevitably the ones tied to your consulting firm." Langdon swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the screen. "Albright is done," Calvin continued, leaning in. "But right now he is desperate. Officer Shepard is dead. Albright ordered you to silence him, and you ran him off Route 50. Do you really think a sitting U.S. Senator is going to let the man who committed murder on his behalf walk onto a plane to Geneva? You aren't leaving the country, Peter. Albright is going to have you killed before you reach the tarmac. You are the ultimate loose end." The realization hit Langdon like a physical blow. The arrogant veneer shattered, leaving behind a terrified, shaking man. I didn't want to kill him," Langdon whispered, his voice cracking. "Albright said to scare him, to run him off the road, so he'd miss his meeting with you. The crash, it was too fast. The car flipped. I panicked. I planted the bottles and ran." Calvin felt a sickening surge of anger, but he forced it down into a cold, sharp blade. "I have a sworn encrypted confession from the man you killed, naming everyone involved. You have one option, Peter. You walk out of here with my investigator. He will take you to a secure black site operated by the Southern District of New York. You will give them Albright. You will give them the dash cam audio. And you will pray they offer you life without parole instead of the lethal injection." Langdon looked at Shaw, who was glaring down at him with dead eyes, then back to Calvin. He slowly nodded. "Take him," Calvin said to Shaw. "I have a Senate hearing to attend." The Dirksen Senate office building was a pressure cooker of anticipation. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity. Protesters outside were chanting loudly enough to rattle the reinforced glass windows. Every major news network in the world was broadcasting live from room 226. At exactly 3 p.m., Senator Richard Albright struck his wooden gavel. The sound cracked like a rifle shot over the PA system. Albright looked down from the elevated mahogany dais. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his bespoke suit immaculate. He wore the confident, solemn expression of a man who believed he had already won. He had received word that Vanguard servers were secure, and Shepard was dead. As far as Albright knew, Calvin Reynolds was cornered, defeated, and about to deliver a humiliating withdrawal speech. "The committee will come to order," Albright announced, leaning into his microphone. "Judge Reynolds, the events of the past few days have been a tragedy for the American judicial system. We have seen a pattern of anger violence and a blatant disregard for law enforcement. It is the opinion of this chair that proceeding with a Supreme Court confirmation would be an insult to the Constitution. Have you reached a decision regarding your nomination?" Calvin sat alone at the witness table. He wore a midnight blue suit, his tie perfectly knotted. He adjusted his microphone. He did not look like a defeated man. He looked like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "I have, Senator," Calvin said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Albright smirked slightly. "And the floor is yours, Judge. Resign with whatever dignity you have left." "I am not resigning," Calvin stated flatly. The gallery erupted into a frenzy of murmurs. Albright's smirk vanished instantly. He grabbed his gavel. "Order, Judge Reynolds, you are under criminal investigation." "I am under an orchestrated hit." Calvin interrupted his voice, rising, cutting through the noise like thunder. "And under the protections of the congressional record, which grants me absolute immunity from civil defamation, while seated at this table, I am submitting the following into evidence." Calvin pulled a stack of papers from his briefcase and slammed them onto the table. "Exhibit A," Calvin declared, reading loudly. "A civil RICO indictment filed at 1 p.m. today in the Southern District of New York against Vanguard Horizon, freezing all assets. Exhibit B wire transfer records, proving Vanguard Horizon, a pass controlled by your brother-in-law, Senator Albright, wired $250,000 to the sister of Officer Brendan Mitchell exactly 4 hours before I was assaulted." "Shut his microphone off," Albright screamed, his face turning purple with rage. "Clerk, cut the feed, Sergeant at Arms, remove this man from the chamber. You cannot silence the truth. Richard." Calvin roared back, abandoning his judicial calm, letting the sheer, unadulterated righteous fury bleed into his voice. The clerk scrambled to hit the mute button on the soundboard, but the microphone stayed live. In the back row, Amanda Croft sat with a heavy-duty laptop resting on her knees. She had anticipated this. She had brought in an independent localized signal booster, hardwiring Calvin's mic directly into the press feeds, bypassing the Senate control room entirely. "Exhibit C," Calvin yelled over the chaos. "The sworn recorded confession of Officer Gary Shepard, who was murdered at 4:15 a.m. this morning on Route 50 by a Vanguard Horizon operative named Peter Langdon." Albright froze. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like a corpse. He hadn't known about Langdon. He thought the crash was clean. "And because I know you wiped the precinct servers, Senator," Calvin continued, his voice echoing through millions of televisions across the globe. "Because I know you believe you erased the truth of what happened to me on that asphalt, I want the American people to hear exactly what your money bought." Calvin pulled the black USB drive from his pocket, plugged it into a small digital audio player he had brought, and held it directly up to his live microphone. He pressed play. The audio was pristine. Officer Mitchell's voice, slurred but unmistakable from the bar recording, echoed through the hallowed halls of the United States Senate. "But Reynolds didn't do shit. I grabbed him, slammed him on the hood. Guy was perfectly calm. Lawson told me to make it look like he was reaching. Easiest 250 I ever made. Albright promised me absolute immunity. Said the judge would be ruined before the sun came up. The silence in the hearing room was absolute, deafening, and catastrophic. Every senator on the dais slowly turned their heads to stare at Richard Albright. The journalists in the press pit stopped typing, their mouths hanging open. Albright slumped back in his leather chair, the gavel slipping from his trembling fingers and hitting the floor. He looked around the room, his eyes wide, darting frantically like a trapped animal. The invincible armor of Washington privilege had just been shattered into a million pieces on live television. Senator Albright, Calvin said, his voice dropping back to a quiet, lethal register that demanded absolute attention. You orchestrated the assault of a federal judge, you corrupted a police department, and you are complicit in the murder of an American police officer. I am not stepping down. I am taking my seat on the Supreme Court. And my very first act as a justice will be to ensure that when your federal indictments reach the appellate level, the law you so callously manipulated will offer you absolutely no mercy. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the hearing room violently swung open. 4 federal marshals wearing tactical vests emblazoned with U.S. Marshal SDNY marched down the center aisle. They were completely out of Albright's jurisdiction, immune to his political leverage. Behind them walked Police Captain Edward Lawson. In handcuffs, his head hung low in utter disgrace. The lead marshal walked directly up the steps of the dais, bypassing the bewildered Senate security. He stopped in front of Senator Richard Albright. Senator Albright. The marshal said, his voice carrying over the dead, silent room. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and federal civil rights violations. Please stand and place your hands behind your back. The gallery exploded. It was a cacophony of screams, camera shutters, and frantic shouting. Senators scrambled over each other to distance themselves from Albright. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee was pulled to his feet, his bespoke suit instantly looking like a prison uniform, as the heavy steel cuffs were ratcheted around his wrists. Calvin Reynolds sat at the witness table, watching the architect of his destruction being led out of the room in disgrace. He felt no joy. He felt no triumphant vindication. He just felt an immense, overwhelming exhaustion. He looked at his own wrists, still bruised yellow and purple from the metal that had bitten into his flesh just days ago. He had won. He had survived the guillotine. But the innocence of his judicial philosophy was gone forever. He had learned that the law was not a shield, it was a sword, and it belonged to whoever swung it the hardest. 2 weeks later, the Senate Judiciary Committee, under new, terrified leadership, voted unanimously to confirm Calvin Reynolds. He was sworn in by the Chief Justice in a quiet, private ceremony. When Calvin put on the heavy black robes of the United States Supreme Court, they felt different than his appellate robes. They felt like armor. He looked out the window toward the Capitol building, the sky gray and unforgiving. He knew the monsters were still out there, hiding in boardrooms and police precincts. But now they had to answer to him. Thank you for reading this incredible story of power corruption and absolute resilience. If Judge Reynolds's brilliant, ruthless fight for justice kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Right now, don't forget to share this dramatic political thriller with your friends and family who love a jaw-dropping plot twist. We are bringing you the most intense